chasing losses is probably the number one indicative sign of whether or not a person has a problem with gambling. The progression of the opioid epidemic only took about a couple of years. With this, we see more of a rapid progression within 6 years. Drug use and alcohol use and dependence, they will oftentimes say gambling is so much worse financially than any other disease.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the One Day at a Time podcast. Today's guest is Abdullah from Maryhaven, which is a group from Ohio that does gambling treatment. He's a clinician there, and we're going to be talking about the ways that problem gambling impacts the brain, as well as some different types of gambling today. Abdullah, thanks for joining.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Rob.
Of course. So, I did a little bit of an intro there, but, why did you get into the space and how's it been?
So, I've been a counselor for about 5-6 years now. I got my start in opioid treatment. So I started counseling individuals with opioid use disorder, as it's like a raving epidemic across the country, as you know, especially here in Ohio. But I kind of stumbled upon the problem gambling field. My predecessor at this agency, Maryhaven in Central Ohio, he kind of invited me out to a focus group about 3 years ago. The focus group was on Asian Americans, specifically Arab Americans, their attitudes and perceptions of problem gambling. So that kind of shifted my focus a little bit. I'm like, okay, this is affecting the communities in which, I want to serve in my own communities, to kind of realize, okay, problem gambling is a real issue. Some clinicians and counselors kind of nudge it off as, okay, that's a problem gambling counselor, or that's that program. I don't have any interest in it. And you kind of have to find your niche in this space. Yeah, that's how I stumbled upon it.
That's awesome. And I definitely want to dive into that in a little bit. But, you reached out to me, and the thing that struck me so much about what you wanted to talk about, that we've never spoken about it thus far on my channel. And one thing that a lot of people probably do, and they might not even realize that it's gambling, which is card breaks. In your clinical experience, have you run into a lot of people who are doing card breaks, and is it gambling?
So yeah, in my clinical experience over the last couple of years, I've only had 2 clients who have been specifically into card breaking and card breaking behavior. So what is a card break? If you go on TikTok and scroll, eventually you're going to come across a card breaking video as well. So people sell, you bid into a specific amount of cards within the deck. You bid to get into that spot. And then, for example, I might just buy into the Cincinnati Reds, for example, and I get every Reds card in that card break. So people are breaking open packs, people are breaking open boxes, cases, live streaming it, and then you will know whether or not you get a profitable card, or you might not get anything at all. So that is very much gambling when we think about wagering, when we think about that risk and the cost, and like whether or not if I'm going to get a benefit out of this. It definitely has its either gambling adjacent behavior or gambling outright in itself.
Does that mean that if someone goes and they buy their own pack of cards, that they're guaranteed to keep the cards that they've bought? Is that investing, or could that be gambling too?
So 2 years ago, I was approached by a woman when I was presenting on problem gambling, and she told me about her son being into Pokemon cards. And she posed that same question. She was like, well, is that gambling? So that's not typically gambling, but if I'm turning over that card for profit, if I'm trying to turn over packs for profit, then that's gambling specifically. If I'm just collecting said packs or said cards for my own collection, is investing as opposed to gambling. But if I'm looking for that quick turn and profit, that's gambling adjacent behavior.
So does it come down to kind of a mixture of like the intention and the speed? Because when I think about card collectors, like I know a lot of people that have TikTok accounts where they talk about collecting baseball cards. They'll get them graded and they'll collect them in like the sleeves and stuff like that. They might go to trade shows and try to sell them. So is that investing? And then there's a different kind of way of doing it that makes it gambling?
And like more anecdotal stories, like, my client has spent over I would say 5 figures, right? Just spending on his card collection. And it gets to a point where we can kind of ask ourselves the same clinical questions. Are you preoccupied by the thought of the next card break? Are you preoccupied by, your next bet, whether or not you're going to find a valuable card? Am I starting to steal or borrow money from other people to finance my habit? It's not just typically investing or collecting cards. The typical person might go into Walmart or Target, buy a pack, buy a case, leave it at that, look at it, and keep it in their collection. But people start to develop clinical problems when they ask themselves those clinical questions, very similar to the 20 questions in GA too, right?
Yeah, for those that don't know, the 20 questions of GA are essentially like 20 qualifying questions that you can kind of ask yourself to kind of understand your relationship with problem gambling. That's really interesting though, that it like changes based on your own intentions and your own thoughts. It's not even necessarily the action of doing the card break. It's like, what is it making you feel then to a certain extent?
Anticipation of the reward, right? Like I'm
Mm.
anticipating getting a hit, so I'm more inclined to repeating this behavior over and over again.
That's fascinating. Could it be similar in like the stock market then? Because I see that a lot too. I did this too, so I don't know why I'm saying it like this, but it's like it's not gambling, it's investing because it's on Robinhood. I'm buying stocks. Now this is investing. Still comes down to that same mindset.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think crypto is really hot among my clients right now, and investing in stocks. And it's quite different than options trading or futures, right? Where I'm like trading on a contract that's set to expire either tomorrow or even the same day. I mean, that's very volatile to where I could wager. Usually I need a minimum amount of capital in these investment accounts, usually a 5-figure sum to even trade in the first place. But like I've seen that be really volatile among my clients to where they're losing that 5-figure sum in one single day due to options or futures. As opposed to typical investing, I'm putting my money into the S&P 500 or an ETF for a specific duration of time. That's your typical investing behavior, right? As opposed to something more volatile within a single day.
I get so many questions, man, to the extent of, is this gambling? And almost without failure, if someone asks that question, I'm like, yes, because you wouldn't be asking me if you really knew. It's always difficult for me to kind of articulate that sometimes yes, sometimes no. So, I mean, I really appreciate you saying that. Is it the same like clinical questions that you would use to say diagnose a gambling disorder, like the DSM-5 criteria?
Yep. So there's 9 of them, and very similar to GA 20 questions. The GA 20 questions has those 9 clinical DSM-5 questions in it as well. The ones I usually ask about, like, have you ever lied about your gambling? And I'll kind of word it in a different way. Have you ever not disclosed about your losses as opposed to your wins? Have you hidden statements from your loved ones, family members? Have you started to chase your losses? I mean, as you know, chasing losses is probably the number one indicative sign of whether or not a person has a problem with gambling. I mean, that's pretty universal among all my clients. They started to chase. So it's like a progression. We think about that time and duration. They started to chase their losses in that time frame. After chasing losses, you started to lie to other people. You're hiding your behavior from other people. And to some certain extent, maybe some criminal activity as well. I know the 20 questions also will ask about legal acts, right? Have you ever committed a crime as a result of your gambling? And there's other clinical questions, preoccupation. Are you constantly thinking about your next bet when you're going to place your next bet? Tolerance, have you needed to bet with increasing amounts of money to get the same desired effect? Withdrawal, are you depressed, irritable, anxious, all of those things when I'm not actively in action?
Hearing those, did basically all of them, and I qualify for almost all those criteria. How many does someone need to say, yeah, I did that, or yeah, that sounds like me, before it confirms that they have a problem?
So clinically is a minimum of 4. However, I mean, I've had plenty of clients that are on that spectrum somewhere. Most of the time, I would say like it's around 7 or 8. And I always ask my clients, I always prompt them to go to a GA meeting, and I'll say, how many of the 20 do you answer yes to? And it's always 18 or 19.
Yeah, that's me, 19.
Yeah, always 18 or 19, yeah.
Now, you mentioned that when you first got into this space, you started with opioid counseling. Could you kind of talk about the similarities and differences between what we saw with the opioid epidemic versus what we're seeing now with sports betting or online gambling?
Yeah, it's like a monopoly, right? So with the opioid epidemic, we saw pharmaceutical companies trying to push OxyContin and oxycodone to the layperson out there, and doctors and prescribers as well. Let's prescribe you, a script for oxycodone for this duration of time. And then once you wean yourself off after 6 months, I'm going to turn over to heroin or some other sort of drug or product, right? We see that now with the industry of sports betting. I mean, these operators and regulators, the progression of the opioid epidemic only took about a couple of years. Let's say 5 to 10 years, right? From the 90s until the late 2000s. With this, I mean, we see more of a rapid progression within 6 years. From 2018 until now. 38 states and the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C. have legalized some form of sports betting and sports wagering. I mean, we have never seen a product be legalized on this standard across the United States than ever before. I mean, it has its implications for youth and adolescents picking this up, along with especially young adult males getting into the action and starting to develop more and more problems associated with gambling. So it's going to rapidly turn into an epidemic if it's not one already.
When we think about like what's actually happening with a problem gambler, is it a similar experience clinically in the brain to an opioid addiction, to be addicted to gambling?
Yep, it affects the same neurotransmitter site, right? So a person has that dopaminergic response. I'm not putting a drug into my body. I'm not putting cocaine, opioids, what have you into my body, but I'm still evoking that same chemistry progression in my brain. I'm still transmitting that dopaminergic response among those neurotransmitter sites. So it feels like as though I'm high, it feels like I'm, up, even though I never even put a substance into my body. And that's what it differentiates from your typical drugs, alcohol, substances, to where gambling is so unique in that way, right? Like I don't need to do anything physically to get that same rush or high.
And you say dopaminergic. To someone that doesn't understand, brain science, what does dopamine do to our body?
So it's a pleasure response center of the brain. So we need dopamine to survive. It's the same reason that it motivates us to have food, to have sex, to go to sleep, to even wake up in the morning. So we need dopaminergic responses in our brain to tell us and motivate us for some sort of reward. Now, what is different about gambling and substance use disorder and gambling disorder is that it's always anticipation of the reward, right? So more dopamine is being released in anticipation of getting said reward. Even with substances, I'm still having a dopaminergic response after using, but I'm also having that in that ritual-like behavior, picking up the substance, calling up my dude, going to a dope house. Same thing happens with gambling too. En route to the casino, getting ready to place my next bet, dopamine is being released among that progression as well.
So a lot of times a question that I'll get is, why did you keep gambling after you were losing? Why didn't you stop after there were negatives in your life? So what you're saying there is the thrill, the feeling of pleasure isn't even coming from gambling, it's coming from what happens just before.
Yep, I don't even have to be in action to get the same response. I mean, we have that phenomenon happen in our brains as we're anticipating some sort of reward. So even if I'm chasing my losses, I'm hoping for that hit, I'm hoping for that win, dopamine is still being released among that progression as well.
So winning and losing doesn't actually matter to a problem gambler.
No, I mean, it does matter. I mean, a win will still matter in the outcome of in events in a problem gambler's life, right? I mean, especially an early big win, that will probably indicate whether or not I'm going to have some sort of problem associated with problem gambling. However, there's also chasing wins, as opposed to chasing losses. We don't really talk about that often, but it happens both ways.
To someone that's kind of hooked to gambling, so now we're only talking to a portion of the audience for this question. If they stop gambling, can their brain fix itself? Can the dopamine levels that they crave go back to what they were before, or are they messed up forever?
Yeah, I just talked about this with a client today. You're going to have days and weeks on end where your old habit or your hobbies and interests don't excite you. And we have this question all the time in treatment. I don't even know what I like anymore. I don't even know what to do with myself. Just because that threshold is so high for yourself now, you've gained a tolerance to that dopaminergic response. You're getting a thrill, you're getting a high from gambling. Maybe playing guitar doesn't cut it anymore. Maybe watching sports doesn't cut it anymore. So I have to retrain my brain for longer periods of time to kind of think that, okay, I can gain pleasure and excitement from everyday daily activities.
Spinning it around to target the other portion of the people that might be watching this, to someone that rarely gambles or gambles, they just kind of know about it. They're clicking on this video because we made it an interesting title, an interesting thumbnail, but they are learning everything new right now. Does problem gambling impact young people, or is it only this stereotypical old woman who's maybe a widow who has this disposable income that's sitting at a slot machine? What does the everyday problem gambler look like now?
Yeah, it ranges from anyone in adolescence to people of the aging demographic, 65 and older, right? Is anyone in between as well. So I think it was about 2 years ago, I was watching my little brother play NBA 2K, I believe. And he went on and he had to make his picks for that week for each team to win or lose. And I thought that was very interesting. It
In
was
the
like,
video game?
yeah, in a video game. I think it was 2K. So I thought that was very interesting. So even embedded into video games, we have gambling adjacent behavior, right? Or even sometimes outright gambling. So even within video games, we have loot boxes, we have, treasure chests or whatever you want to call them, to where I can buy into virtual currency, use V-Bucks, for example, to buy a loot box in Fortnite. Now, this loot box doesn't tell me whether or not if it's going to be a valuable item. I kind of just have to guess and buy it myself. So for when that loot box does open up, it might be a valuable item. It might not be nothing at all. So that is gambling. I mean, it's gambling embedded into video games, and younger people are being taught this behavior from an earlier age. It's very interesting.
Yeah. And you know what? Young people are so impressionable. I have a friend, I wonder if she'll watch this video. Her dad told her when she was a kid that if she swallowed a watermelon seed, that a watermelon plant would grow in her stomach and she would blow up like a watermelon. And she believed that until she was way older than she should have been. Yeah. She was probably 18 years old. Thinking about how impressionable a young person is, if, say, a 11 or 12-year-old's playing some Fortnite with their friends, say they're, 8th graders or whatever, and they're starting to do these loot boxes, they're starting to buy these skins, they're basically gambling. What is that doing to their brains over the long run?
It's introducing them into that dopaminergic response, right? It's introducing them to gambling adjacent behavior or gambling outright in itself. It's telling that young person, that adolescent mind, that, okay, it's okay to gamble, it's okay to take risk, and that you might win. And that might be true, but how much money am I going to wager to eventually for that hit to come? And, around this time, around the holidays, we have a lot of gift givers who give out, scratchers and stockings at Christmas time. What kind of implications does that have for a young developing mind? They might win. And that win, that $20, $10, that is a lot for a child. It might not be a lot to you and I, but to a child, it might change their world. So they don't forget those early childhood memories, right? Those adverse experiences regarding gambling. I mean, I've heard so many stories from my clients about going down to the track with their dad at a young age. And it was like sort of like a bonding activity, or their family was playing bingo. And it was very much a bonding activity for that whole family to be involved. But that does set its implications for future use as well.
I'll play devil's advocate just because I imagine that a lot of parents hearing this for the first time are probably thinking to themselves, is it really that deep? Is it? Like, why should I theoretically walk on eggshells with my kid to make them better understand this?
People are going to gamble no matter what, right? Families are going to gamble no matter what. And some people who have those early introductions to gambling might not develop problems and later on in adulthood. However, it's important to have this open and honest conversation with our loved ones, with our younger children, about what does this mean for the future? Is it okay to take a risk? When does a risk become too much? Am I becoming more competitive with taking risks? I mean, all those kind of pose questions in which we can kind of develop it into more of an open dialogue with our loved ones, as opposed to shutting down the conversation.
Sure. So just better to touch base about it rather than let it play out and hope for the best.
Because people are going to buy those loot boxes. However, we can have a conversation about what a loot box is and how is gambling adjacent or is gambling in itself, right? Or even that Pokemon card example, like, what does this mean for the future as well? Like, am I getting a thrill out of this, or is it just solely for collecting?
So if I'm a parent and say my son or daughter has just gone off to college, they give me a call and I'm so concerned that they're binge drinking, because that's what I did when I went to college. They tell me, no, we're just betting on some sports, hanging out at the house. Should I be viewing that as a better alternative? Should I be like happy, like, oh, thank God they're not drinking, they're just gambling? That's fine. Like, what would you say to a parent in that situation?
So it's a fallacy, right? Like, clients do this all the time. I have plenty of clients that have histories of drug use or alcohol use, and they view gambling as a safer alternative. And we hear this from caregivers, family members, and loved ones that, oh, at least he's not injecting drugs, or at least he's not using alcohol or drinking too much. Yeah, I might not be physiologically affected by gambling as much as substances. However, I'm still having, financial troubles as a result of my disease. Lying-like behavior, white lies. I'm keeping this from family, friends. So sparking that open dialogue with our family members. I mean, what do you like about gambling? What brings you so much excitement about gambling? Kind of lets you kind of gain the insight into their behavior. I did a lot of work on the helpline here in Ohio, and we would get calls from family members all the time about this issue. At some point, they do have to kind of let it go and get their own help, whether it's therapy, GA, or whatnot. And if they do think of it as a safer alternative, we would kind of argue those points of look at the clinical diagnosis and the criteria. If they're exhibiting these warning signs, then it might be beneficial just to talk to a professional. And that professional is going to be judgment free. They're not going to kind of shut down the conversation and say you need to get help, but they're going to gauge and want to know what they like about gambling and if they're ready to stop.
I think it's also for parents tough because it's probably they're reflecting what they learned when they were younger. For example, in my situation, my mom was like, "You better not be smoking weed." And I'm like, "Okay, yeah, you got it." But then I'm turning around and I'm betting $1,000 on a basketball game, right? So it's like, unless people grow up knowing the risks, it feels like a better alternative. I empathize with that because it's difficult. You're expecting that something is going to go wrong. Like kids, we do dumb stuff, but you're hoping that it's like a better thing that goes wrong. It's just, that's tough.
And my clients would tell me the opposite most of the time, especially with my caseload, my clients having histories of drug use and alcohol use and dependence. They will oftentimes say gambling is so much worse financially than any other disease. When you have limitations in place, right? I can only drink so much before I get alcohol poisoning.
Sure.
I can only use so much before I risk overdosing on said substance, right? With gambling, I have no limitations in place. I can take out 5 loans in one single night and continue my behavior well into the morning. So there's little to no limitations on that.
It's like when you see a commercial for alcohol, it tells you to drink responsibly. When you see a commercial for gambling, it tells you, like, let's just say gamble responsibly. Usually it doesn't even say that, but say it does. What does that look like? Because I know drink responsibly means don't go over the legal limit and then drive a car. What does gamble responsibly even mean?
Yeah, we do a lot of education groups with the community, people who might have, co-occurring diagnoses such as mental health and addiction, substance addiction, and they might not have problems with gambling whatsoever. We talk about what is safer gambling practices. I know there's a lot of criticism out there of that, but however, majority of people are able to gamble without any sort of problem, right? And those people are usually setting limits in place, limits in time being spent at the casino, time being spent on their phone gambling, and money, right? Like limitations on how much money I'm bringing to the casino or how much money is being wagered in the first place. Along with, I'm only going for maybe once a year. Twice a year. I'm only sports betting, once a season, as opposed to that habitual progression of every single day. Or I'm beginning to chase my losses, and that's what differentiates problem gambling from regular gambling as well.
In your clinical opinion, can a problem gambler gamble responsibly?
No.
You mentioned that one of the communities that you wanted to serve was the Arab community, the Arab American community. What is the general understanding of gambling within that community? Do the actions that you're seeing kind of align with those beliefs?
When I went out to that focus group about 2 years ago, like I said, a colleague invited me out, my predecessor, who was a gaming counselor at this agency. And he invited me, said that we're going to talk to a group of Muslim Americans, Arab Americans, and talk about gambling and their perceptions and implications for their community. And what I got out of that conversation kind of sparked my interest in this field, me changing over jobs and like changing roles. But what I saw is that, a lot of people are saying that it's haram. It's sinful, right? Like in some religions, especially of the Islam faith, it is a sin to gamble. But sometimes we're told by our caregivers or parents that it's haram, it's sinful, but we're never given like an explanation as to why. And it was very interesting. Out of that conversation, we saw some people talking about their betting experiences and gambling experiences. They would hide it from their loved ones. They would hide it from their families because of, stigma, social stigma in that faith community. And even within the family as well. I was reluctant to disclose about my gambling because I was afraid of my mom and dad, or I was afraid of, what would my faith community say? Along with, sparking those conversations around what is gambling. We had a session of 3 focus groups. They thought of investing, options, futures, trading as not gambling. We talked about how similar it could be to gambling. But one person did bring that up. I was like, okay, if it is, sinful to gamble, what kind of implications does typical investments have? know, it is a risk-taking behavior. I mean, the S&P 500 or the NASDAQ could go down at any given moment.
Sure.
So I thought that was really fascinating. I mean, on one hand, you're telling me, or you're telling your community, you're telling your family that it's sinful to gamble. However, we're not talking about what other risk-taking behavior could be like, for example, day trading.
Was an explanation given within that focus group as to why it is sinful to gamble?
It just, in our faith, there's just one person taking advantage of another person, whether if it's the book for sports betting or the casino. For when people, human beings, take advantage of another human being financially, it's exploitation. And that is why it's a sin. In other cultures, they might look at it negatively as well. And interest is also sinful in our faith and community. So when we have interest rates on loans, when you have interest rates on mortgages, I mean, technically it is also haram because it's exploitation of human beings, right, financially. So I think that's interesting. I mean, that is something that we adhere to, but we don't think about the implications or social stigma around our families or communities sometimes.
It is fascinating. That's, I imagine, very difficult to navigate, but probably just becomes part of life, I would assume. Like, you just kind of, it is what it is. It's just, I've never heard
it is true to a point, though. I mean, it is exploitation, right?
Yeah, totally.
We can kind of reframe it and think of it as like, okay, why are we engaging in an activity that is going to bring billions of dollars to the book or operator when I'm like regressively being taxed for my behavior, right? Like, I'm just the layperson trying to place a bet. However, I might lose $1,000 or I might lose, 5-figure sum. It is outright exploitation.
So just recently, the U.S. Senate had a committee where they talked about problem gambling. They talked about sports betting and kind of what's going on in the United States. Were you able to watch that? And if so, could you provide maybe like a brief summary of what was discussed?
Yeah, I watched most of it. The committee had heard from 4 or 5 different individuals talking about the Safe Bet Act and the GRIT Act. And for those of you that don't know what the GRIT Act is, it's basically ensuring that there's going to be some sort of federal funding from the federal government towards problem gambling treatment and prevention services. The Safe Bet Act is also ensuring that there's protections around marketing, advertisements, and also with messaging and AI within the operator space. So what kind of implications does that have for the public? They're kind of evoking that there should be some sort of federal regulation or at least some sort of federal input from our people, our legislators in the Senate and House about sports betting and online gaming. Which I agree with. Decision in 2018, the PASPA being overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court, kind of laid it at the hands of the individual states. However, each state is different. It's not universal. There is no universal protection or consumer protection in place for people placing a bet. As much as everybody else knows nowadays, I mean, you can't watch a sporting event without seeing FanDuel commercials or DraftKings commercials. So it's everywhere. I mean, yeah, the U.S. spends billions of dollars in pharmaceutical ads as well, but we're seeing that same thing take place with sports betting.
I want to hear your opinion on kind of one thing from each act that's been discussed today. Starting with the Safe Bet Act, what is like the clinical implications of seeing this many gambling ads? Like, is it making people, one, more likely to gamble? Is there any impact on it being more problematic? What about young people?
Yeah, there was a study out of Bristol, I believe, in the UK with the amount of advertisements and logos that had to appear during certain sporting events, and they found thousands within games. And I mean, it's appalling to say the least. I mean, we have young developing minds who are watching these sporting events with their caregivers, parents, families. There's a new generation now, right? Gen Z and so forth that would never know a world of sports without gambling included in it. I can't watch, a game without seeing the lines. I can't watch a game without seeing the spread. And nowadays, even the commentators, even the reporters are actually picking out their own parlays and putting it out there for the public to see. Even young developing minds, adolescents are also seeing their parlay picks. So what kind of messages does that convey to the public? It's allowing people to see that, okay, gambling is being accepted by not just the industry, but the layperson, the American, in a negative way too, right? Like, I'm going to see that children are going to start asking questions about gambling. Now, should I gamble? Should I bet? Families are, picking picks together. So it's becoming more of a ceremonial event in an American household, and does definitely have its negative implications for the future as well.
More access, more visibility, more normalization, more problems. It's the
Yeah,
inevitable.
for sure. Yeah.
Within the GRIT Act now, the other act that was discussed at the Senate hearing, that's more towards, funding. So where do you think funding would be most effective at preventing gambling harm in the United States?
So I think it should be from a public health perspective, first and foremost. Like if we start with a prevention and by using a public health advocacy efforts and model, we would ensure that consumers or the public would have a better understanding of problem gambling. What are some of the warning signs and risk? Being informed as a consumer before I place my first bet, what could possibly happen. I mean, we do that here at Maryhaven with our prevention outreach efforts and with community stakeholders, the community, educate them on problem gambling, why it could be a serious issue for you and your family and loved ones. Along with treatment, after a problem has started to develop with an individual, using clinical interventions like CBT, MI, and so forth are really crucial in this space. And what's really different from the opioid use that I was used to for so many years is that there is federal funding for opioid use disorder treatment and intervention and prevention. We see that coming down from SAMHSA, but there is $0 federally for any sort of recognized treatment and prevention of problem gambling services. And that is problematic for the United States.
What keeps you going? What keeps you motivated to do the work that you do, to keep seeing clients and to keep trying to, reduce gambling harm?
Yeah, at Maryhaven, I love my job. And I genuinely mean that. Like, I love going to work. Some days, I don't want to get up. However, I love seeing the change in my clients. And like I told you, Rob, I don't think I'm an expert by any means. I always tell clients that they're the experts. They have the answers for their lives. They have the answers as to how to evoke change in their lives. There's always an external motivator, whether if it's a spouse, family, loved one, getting them to treatment. However, they're sitting here in my office now. And how can we evoke that change and get that momentum going? What motivates me to go to work every day is seeing the change, seeing people flip their lives around, get better financially, and their loved ones, family as well.
If you could say something to a young problem gambler that's maybe on the fence about going and getting help, what would you tell them?
That hope is available. That, if you're thinking about getting help, if you're, contemplating whether or not you should go to treatment, therapy is always confidential in this space, right? Like if you're afraid of getting help for other people to find out, whether it's your employer or loved ones, it's always confidential and judgment free. And you can always call 1-800-GAMBLER anywhere in the United States and get linked to resources, whether if it's clinical therapy, counseling, or your local GA meeting. I mean, we always push people to go towards GA because a lot of therapists and counselors out there don't have any lived experience, right? They don't know how it is to compulsively make that bet over and over again. So that is a critical aspect of a person's recovery, is going out to a 12-step group.
Well, Abdullah, thank you so much for being on. And I'm going to see you in person at the National Conference on Problem Gambling's conference in Columbus this summer. To anyone that's watching this video, if you're in the state of Ohio, you can call 1-800-GAMBLER. You can also call that number from anywhere in the United States. Check the description of this video for links on where to get resources, and watch this video if you want to hear a story of someone who's in recovery from gambling addiction. Let's keep getting better together, one day at a time.